My wife told everyone I needed a nursing home because I was losing my mind, and she even filled out admission papers while I was supposedly napping in my chair. What she didn't know was that I wasn't sleeping at all. I was wide awake and recording every word she said to her lawyer about getting control of my $7 million fortune by having me declared incompetent. I'm George. I'm 74 years old, and this is the story of how my scheming wife tried to steal my life and my money, but ended up losing everything when she discovered that this old man was much sharper than she ever imagined. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from today. You know, they say that marriage is about loving someone through sickness and health, for better or worse, till death do you part. But what happens when the person you trusted with your life decides that death is taking too long and tries to speed up the process by burying you alive in a nursing home while they spend your money? This is a story about betrayal, greed, and what happens when someone underestimates the very person they're trying to destroy. It's about the moment when a supposedly confused old man reveals that he's been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Let me start from the beginning, back when I still believed that my second wife actually loved me for something other than my bank account. I'm a retired owner of a successful chain of auto repair shops that I built from nothing over 40 years. I started with one small garage in 1978, working 18-hour days and sleeping on a cot in the back office to save money on rent. Through hard work, honest dealing, and smart business decisions, I eventually owned 12 locations across 3 states and employed over 200 people. When I sold the business 5 years ago, I walked away with enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes. My first wife Helen and I were married for 38 years before she died of cancer 6 years ago. Helen was the love of my life, my business partner, and my best friend. She helped me build our company from the ground up, handling the books while I worked on cars and managed operations. We were one of those couples who did everything together, who finished each other's sentences, and who never went to bed angry. Helen's death left a hole in my life that I thought could never be filled, and for 2 years after she passed, I lived alone in our big house, going through the motions of daily life but not really living. That's when I met Carol at a church social event. Carol was 58 years old, 15 years younger than me, and recently divorced from what she described as an abusive marriage that had left her financially devastated. She was beautiful in a way that Helen had never been, with perfectly styled blonde hair, manicured nails, and the kind of figure that made men half my age take notice. Carol seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, asking thoughtful questions about my business, my life with Helen, and my experiences as a widower. She was sympathetic about my loss and impressed by my success, but not in a way that seemed calculated or artificial. Carol presented herself as a woman who'd been through hard times and was looking for companionship and security with a good man. She talked about how tired she was of dating younger men who were immature and unreliable, and how much she valued the wisdom and stability that came with an older partner. Carol said she wasn't looking for someone to take care of her financially, but rather someone she could take care of emotionally and physically as we both navigated the challenges of aging. It was exactly what I wanted to hear after 2 years of loneliness and grief. Our courtship lasted 8 months, during which Carol was everything I could have asked for in a companion. She was attentive without being clingy, affectionate without being demanding, and interested in my life without being intrusive. Carol would cook elaborate dinners for me, accompany me to business events and social functions, and spend quiet evenings talking about everything from politics to philosophy. She seemed genuinely fascinated by my stories about building my business and my travels with Helen, and she never made me feel guilty for talking about my late wife or keeping her memory alive. Carol also presented herself as someone who was financially independent and not looking for a man to support her. She claimed to have a small but steady income from her divorce settlement and her part-time work as a real estate agent. Carol insisted on paying for dates sometimes and would bring expensive gifts and wine when she visited my house. She talked about her own retirement planning and investment strategies like someone who was responsible with money and didn't need anyone else's financial support. Looking back now, I can see that this was all part of her long-term strategy to convince me that she wasn't a gold digger. We got married in a small ceremony at the same church where we'd met, with just a few close friends and my adult children from my first marriage as witnesses. My kids, Robert and Susan, were polite to Carol but clearly skeptical about my decision to remarry so soon after their mother's death. They worried that I was vulnerable and lonely and might be making a mistake with someone I hadn't known very long. But Carol was charming and respectful toward my children, acknowledging that she could never replace their mother and promising to honor Helen's memory while building a new life with me. For the first year of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. Carol was an attentive and loving wife who took excellent care of me and our home. She managed the household efficiently, planned interesting activities and trips for us to enjoy together, and seemed genuinely happy to be married to me. Carol was also socially active, making friends in our community and getting involved in church activities and charitable organizations. She presented us as a happy couple who'd found love again after loss, and everyone who knew us commented on how good we were together and how much Carol had brightened my life. But gradually, subtle changes began to appear in Carol's behavior and our relationship dynamics. It started with small comments about my memory and my physical capabilities. Carol would mention that I'd forgotten conversations we'd had or appointments we'd made, even when I was certain I remembered everything perfectly. She'd express concern about my driving, suggesting that my reflexes might not be what they used to be and that she should take over more of the transportation responsibilities. Carol would also comment on my energy levels and my ability to handle physical tasks around the house, insisting on hiring services for work that I was perfectly capable of doing myself. At first, I thought Carol was just being protective and caring, the way any loving spouse would be concerned about their partner's well-being as they aged. But the frequency and intensity of these comments increased over time, and Carol began making them in front of other people. She would apologize to friends and family for my supposed forgetfulness or confusion, acting embarrassed by behavior that was completely normal for someone my age. Carol started treating me like I was becoming incompetent, speaking to me in a patronizing tone, and making decisions for me without asking my opinion. The most disturbing development was Carol's increasing interest in my financial affairs and estate planning. She began asking detailed questions about my assets, my investment accounts, and my will. Carol claimed that she needed to understand our financial situation in order to help manage our household expenses and plan for our future together. She suggested that I should add her name to my bank accounts and investment portfolios so that she could help with financial management and have access to funds in case of emergency. Carol also pushed for me to update my will to include her as my primary beneficiary, arguing that spouses should take care of each other and that my adult children were already financially stable. Carol's pressure about financial matters became more intense after our first anniversary. She started complaining that I was too secretive about money and that married couples should be completely transparent about their assets and financial planning. Carol claimed that my reluctance to give her access to my accounts and my hesitation about changing my will showed that I didn't trust her or view her as a true partner in our marriage. She accused me of treating her like a temporary companion rather than a permanent wife, and she threatened to leave me if I didn't start including her more fully in my financial affairs. I was torn between wanting to trust my wife and feeling uncomfortable with the level of financial access she was demanding. Carol's request seemed reasonable on the surface, but something about her urgency and her methods made me cautious. I decided to compromise by adding Carol's name to one of my smaller checking accounts and updating my will to leave her a substantial inheritance while still providing for my children and favorite charities. I thought this would satisfy Carol's need for security while protecting the majority of my assets and ensuring that my wealth would benefit multiple people rather than just one. But my compromise only seemed to increase Carol's appetite for more control over my finances. She began pushing for access to my larger investment accounts and my business assets, claiming that she needed to understand our complete financial picture in order to plan for our retirement years together. Carol also started questioning my spending decisions and my charitable giving, arguing that I was being too generous with organizations and people outside our immediate family. She suggested that I should focus on securing our own future before worrying about helping others, and she criticized me for giving money to my children and grandchildren when we might need those funds for our own care as we aged. Around this time, Carol began making more frequent and more public comments about my supposed mental decline. She would tell friends and family that I was becoming forgetful and confused, that I was having trouble managing complex tasks, and that she was worried about my cognitive health. Carol would share specific examples of my alleged confusion or poor judgment, stories that were either completely fabricated or gross exaggerations of normal human mistakes. She presented herself as a devoted wife who was struggling to care for a husband whose mental faculties were deteriorating, and she received sympathy and support from people who believed her stories. Carol also started suggesting that I should see a doctor about my memory problems and consider getting evaluated for dementia or other cognitive disorders. She claimed that early intervention could help slow the progression of my condition, and that ignoring the warning signs would only make things worse. Carol offered to accompany me to medical appointments and to help communicate my symptoms to healthcare providers, positioning herself as my advocate and caregiver. When I insisted that there was nothing wrong with my memory or my thinking, Carol would become frustrated and accuse me of being in denial about my condition. The situation escalated when Carol began involving my children in her campaign to convince everyone that I was losing my mental capacity. She would call Robert and Susan to report incidents of my supposed confusion or poor judgment, expressing concern about my ability to live independently and manage my own affairs. Carol painted herself as the responsible spouse who was trying to protect me from myself, while portraying me as a stubborn old man who refused to acknowledge his declining abilities. She suggested that my children should intervene to help me accept that I needed more supervision and assistance with daily living activities. My children were initially skeptical of Carol's reports, knowing that I'd always been sharp and independent. But Carol was persistent and convincing in her descriptions of my alleged decline, and she provided specific examples and detailed stories that made her concerns seem legitimate. Over time, Robert and Susan began to worry that they weren't seeing the full picture during their visits with me, and that Carol might be witnessing problems that I was hiding from them, or that only became apparent during extended daily interaction. Carol encouraged my children to support her efforts to get me proper medical evaluation and care. Things came to a head 6 months ago when Carol announced that she'd been researching assisted living facilities and thought it might be time for us to consider moving to a place where I could get the care and supervision she believed I needed. Carol presented this as a loving decision made in my best interests, arguing that I would be safer and happier in an environment designed for people with cognitive issues. She claimed that trying to care for me at home was becoming too difficult and stressful for her, and that professional caregivers would be better equipped to handle my needs as my condition continued to deteriorate. I was shocked and outraged by Carol's suggestion that I needed institutional care. I knew that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, that I was fully capable of living independently, and that Carol's concerns about my mental state were either delusional or deliberately fabricated. I refused to consider moving to any kind of care facility and told Carol that her assessment of my cognitive abilities was completely wrong. I also began to suspect that Carol's campaign to convince everyone that I was incompetent was motivated by something other than genuine concern for my well-being. Carol's reaction to my refusal was telling. Instead of being relieved that I felt capable of continuing to live independently, she became angry and frustrated. Carol accused me of being stubborn and unrealistic about my condition, and she threatened to take drastic action to protect me from my own poor judgment. She said that if I wouldn't voluntarily accept the help I needed, she might have to explore legal options to ensure that I received proper care. Carol also escalated her complaints to my children, telling them that I was becoming increasingly difficult and that my refusal to acknowledge my problems was putting both of us in danger. That's when I decided to start paying much closer attention to Carol's behavior and her conversations when she thought I wasn't listening. I began pretending to nap in my recliner in the afternoons, a habit that Carol had developed a routine around. She would wait until she thought I was asleep and then make phone calls or have conversations that she wouldn't have if she knew I was awake. What I discovered during these fake napping sessions was absolutely chilling and completely confirmed my worst suspicions about Carol's motives and methods. The first conversation I overheard was between Carol and someone she called her lawyer, discussing strategies for having me declared mentally incompetent so that she could gain legal control over my finances and medical decisions. Carol was explaining that she'd been building a case for months by documenting supposed incidents of my confusion and poor judgment, and by getting statements from friends and family members who were concerned about my cognitive decline. She was working with her lawyer to file a petition for guardianship that would give her complete authority over my assets and my life decisions. Carol and her lawyer discussed the process of having me evaluated by court-appointed doctors who would assess my mental capacity and make recommendations about my need for supervised care. They talked about the kinds of evidence that would be most convincing to a judge, including medical records, witness statements, and documentation of specific incidents that demonstrated my alleged incompetence. Carol was methodical and strategic in her approach, treating my potential incapacitation like a business deal that required careful planning and execution. She was confident that she could convince a court that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs and that her guardianship would be in my best interests. During another fake napping session, I heard Carol talking to someone about nursing homes and the costs associated with long-term care. She was discussing how my assets could be used to pay for institutional care while preserving as much of my wealth as possible for her own use after I died. Carol was calculating how long my money would last if I lived in an expensive care facility versus a more modest one, and she was planning how to structure my finances to maximize her inheritance while still providing for my care costs. The callousness of this conversation was breathtaking, listening to my wife plan my institutionalization and death like a financial investment strategy. But the most damning conversation I overheard was between Carol and a man she called her partner, who was clearly more than just a business associate or friend. Carol was discussing their plans for after she gained control of my assets, talking about trips they would take and purchases they would make once my money was available to them. She was promising this man that their patience would pay off soon, that the guardianship proceedings were moving forward, and that they would finally be able to enjoy the lifestyle they'd been planning for years. Carol was essentially conducting an affair with someone who was helping her steal my life and my money, and they were both treating my potential incapacitation as a business opportunity rather than a human tragedy. This conversation revealed that Carol's entire relationship with me had been a long-term con game, designed to position her to inherit my wealth, while minimizing the time and effort she had to invest in actually being my wife. Carol had never loved me or cared about my well-being. She had simply identified me as a wealthy older man who could be manipulated and eventually disposed of once she gained legal control over his assets. Her partner was apparently providing emotional and possibly financial support for her scheme, waiting in the wings to enjoy the fruits of her deception, once I was safely locked away in an institution. I was devastated and furious to learn the truth about Carol's intentions, but I was also relieved to finally understand what had been happening to me and why I'd felt so confused and defensive about her behavior. Carol wasn't a loving wife who was concerned about my declining mental health. She was a predator who was systematically destroying my reputation and my relationships in order to steal my money and my freedom. Her campaign to convince everyone that I was incompetent wasn't based on genuine observation of cognitive decline. It was a calculated strategy to create the legal justification for taking control of my life. Once I understood what Carol was really doing, I began planning my response carefully and strategically. I knew that I needed to document her scheme thoroughly before confronting her or taking any legal action. I also knew that I had to be smart about how I handled the situation, because Carol had already convinced many people that I was losing my mental capacity, and my accusations against her might be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a man with dementia. I needed irrefutable evidence of her deception and her criminal intentions before I could expose her and protect myself. I started by purchasing a small digital recording device that I could hide in my clothing while I pretended to nap in my chair. Over the course of several weeks, I recorded multiple conversations between Carol and her lawyer, Carol and her partner, and Carol, and various other people involved in her scheme to have me declared incompetent. The recordings provided clear evidence that Carol was deliberately fabricating stories about my mental decline, that she was planning to institutionalize me against my will, and that her ultimate goal was to gain control of my money rather than to provide me with appropriate care. I also began documenting my own mental acuity by keeping detailed journals of my daily activities, my thoughts and observations, and my interactions with other people. I wanted to create a clear record that would demonstrate my cognitive abilities and contradict Carol's claims about my supposed confusion and poor judgment. I took online cognitive assessments and arranged for independent medical evaluations that confirmed my mental sharpness and my capacity to make my own decisions about my life and my finances. I was building a comprehensive case that would prove Carol's allegations were false and malicious. Additionally, I started reconnecting with old friends and family members who knew me well and could testify to my continued mental competence. I made sure to have substantive conversations with these people about current events, business matters, and personal topics that would demonstrate my ability to think clearly and communicate effectively. I wanted to have multiple witnesses who could contradict Carol's narrative about my cognitive decline, and who could provide evidence that I was still the same sharp, capable person I'd always been. The most challenging part of my planning was figuring out how to handle the legal and financial aspects of protecting myself from Carol's scheme. I knew that I needed to revoke any powers of attorney or other legal documents that gave Carol any authority over my affairs, and I needed to change my will to remove her as a beneficiary. But I also knew that any dramatic changes to my estate planning might be used as evidence of my supposed mental instability, or as proof that I was being influenced by outside parties who were manipulating me against my wife's interests. I decided to work with a new lawyer who specialized in elder law and who could help me navigate the complex legal issues involved in protecting myself from a spouse who was trying to have me declared incompetent. My new lawyer, Patricia Williams, was experienced in cases involving financial abuse of elderly people and understood the tactics that predators like Carol typically used to gain control over their victims' assets. Patricia helped me develop a comprehensive legal strategy that would protect my interests while also creating a strong defense against Carol's guardianship petition. The breakthrough moment came when I decided to confront Carol directly with evidence of her scheme, but not in the way she would expect. Instead of accusingly challenging her or threatening legal action, I decided to let Carol think that her plan was working, and that I was actually starting to experience the cognitive decline she'd been fabricating. I began acting slightly confused and forgetful in front of Carol, making small mistakes and asking repetitive questions that would seem to confirm her stories about my mental deterioration. Carol was delighted by what she perceived as evidence that I was finally succumbing to the dementia she'd been claiming I had all along. She began documenting these incidents more aggressively and sharing them with her lawyer as proof that her concerns about my mental state were legitimate and that guardianship proceedings should be expedited. Carol also became more careless about hiding her true intentions and her conversations with her co-conspirators, apparently believing that my declining mental state made it safe for her to be less discreet about her activities. This gave me the opportunity to gather even more evidence of her scheme and her criminal intentions. After 2 months of this deception, during which I recorded dozens of conversations and documented extensive evidence of Carol's fraud, I was ready to spring my trap. I arranged for Patricia Williams to file a comprehensive legal complaint against Carol that included charges of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The complaint was supported by all the recordings I'd made of Carol's conversations, medical evaluations proving my mental competency, and testimony from witnesses who could verify my continued cognitive abilities. On a Tuesday morning in March, while Carol thought I was taking my usual afternoon nap, she was having another conversation with her lawyer about accelerating the guardianship proceedings because my condition seemed to be deteriorating more rapidly. Carol was excited about the progress they were making and confident that they would soon have legal control over my assets and my medical decisions. She was discussing the specific nursing home where she planned to place me and calculating how much money would be available for her own use once my care costs were covered. Carol was also making plans to see her partner that evening to celebrate their impending success and to finalize their arrangements for enjoying my money once the guardianship was in place. That's when I opened my eyes, sat up in my chair, and told Carol that I'd been recording every word of her conversation and that I had months of evidence documenting her scheme to defraud me and steal my life. I played back portions of her conversation with her lawyer, letting Carol hear her own voice discussing her plans to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized against my will. I also played recordings of her conversations with her partner, exposing their affair and their conspiracy to steal my money and enjoy it together once I was safely locked away in a care facility. Carol's face went through a series of expressions as she realized that her carefully planned scheme had been completely exposed. First, there was confusion as she tried to understand how I could have been recording her when I was supposed to be asleep and mentally incompetent. Then came fear as she began to grasp the legal implications of what I'd discovered and documented. Finally, there was anger as Carol realized that I'd been playing her the same way she'd been playing me, pretending to be something I wasn't in order to gather information and plan my response to her deception. Carol immediately tried to deny everything, claiming that I'd misunderstood her conversations and that her discussions with lawyers and other people were motivated by genuine concern for my well-being rather than by greed or malicious intent. She insisted that she loved me and wanted what was best for me, and that any appearance of self-interest was simply practical planning for our future together, as I continued to age and potentially decline. Carol tried to turn the situation around by accusing me of being paranoid and suspicious, suggesting that my decision to secretly record her was evidence of the mental instability she'd been concerned about all along. But her denials and counter-accusations were unconvincing in the face of hours of recorded evidence that clearly revealed her true intentions and her criminal conspiracy. Carol's conversations with her lawyer and her partner left no doubt about her motives or her methods, and no amount of explanation or justification could make those recordings say anything other than what they clearly revealed. I told Carol that I'd already filed legal complaints against her, and that law enforcement would be arriving shortly to arrest her for elder abuse and fraud. I also informed her that I'd changed all my financial accounts and revoked any legal authority she might have had over my affairs, and that her name had been removed from my will and all other estate planning documents. Carol would receive nothing from our marriage except whatever legal consequences resulted from her criminal behavior, and she would have no further access to my money or my property. I gave Carol one opportunity to confess her crimes and cooperate with authorities in hopes of receiving a lighter sentence, but she refused to admit any wrongdoing or show any remorse for what she tried to do to me. Carol continued to insist that she was the victim of my paranoia and mental instability, and she threatened to proceed with her guardianship petition as evidence that I was too confused and suspicious to make rational decisions about my own life. She seemed to believe that she could still convince a court that I was incompetent despite all the evidence I'd gathered proving otherwise. Within an hour of my confrontation with Carol, police officers arrived at my house with a warrant for her arrest on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Carol was taken into custody while trying to call her lawyer and her partner to warn them that their scheme had been exposed. The officers also confiscated Carol's phone, computer, and personal documents as evidence in the criminal case against her and her co-conspirators. Watching Carol being led away in handcuffs was one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life, knowing that justice was finally being served and that her attempt to destroy my life had failed completely. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Carol's lawyer was also arrested and charged with conspiracy and fraud for his role in the scheme to have me falsely declared incompetent. Carol's partner was charged as an accessory to fraud and elder abuse for his participation in planning to steal my money and property. All three defendants were faced with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, including hours of recorded conversations that clearly documented their intentions and their methods. Carol's attempt to claim that I was mentally incompetent was thoroughly debunked by multiple medical evaluations and cognitive assessments that proved my mental sharpness and my capacity to make my own decisions. The court was particularly interested in Carol's systematic campaign to fabricate evidence of my cognitive decline and her manipulation of my family and friends to support her false narrative about my mental state. The judge described Carol's behavior as a particularly cruel form of elder abuse that not only attempted to steal my money, but also tried to destroy my autonomy and my relationships with people who cared about me. Carol was sentenced to 8 years in prison for elder abuse and fraud, while her lawyer received a 6-year sentence and was permanently disbarred from practicing law. Carol's partner received 4 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. All 3 defendants were also ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution, though of course they had no assets to speak of since their entire scheme had been based on stealing my money rather than earning their own. The court also issued permanent restraining orders preventing any of them from contacting me or coming near my property once they were released from prison. The aftermath of Carol's arrest and conviction was both liberating and educational for me. I was relieved to have my life and my freedom back, and I was vindicated in my belief that there had been nothing wrong with my mental capacity despite Carol's persistent claims to the contrary. But I was also sobered by the realization of how close Carol had come to succeeding in her scheme, and how easily she might have gained control over my life and my money if I hadn't discovered her true intentions when I did. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, vulnerability, and the importance of staying alert to predatory behavior, even from people who seem to love and care about you. I learned that there are people in the world who view elderly individuals as targets rather than as human beings, and who are willing to destroy lives and families in pursuit of financial gain. Carol had studied me carefully and planned her deception methodically, taking advantage of my loneliness and my desire for companionship to position herself to steal everything I'd worked for throughout my life. Her scheme was sophisticated and patient, designed to unfold over years rather than months, so that her eventual control over my affairs would seem natural and inevitable rather than sudden and suspicious. I also learned about the importance of maintaining independence and skepticism, even within intimate relationships, and about the value of documenting and verifying important information, rather than simply trusting what other people tell you about yourself or your capabilities. Carol's ability to convince other people that I was losing my mental capacity showed me how easily perceptions can be manipulated, and how important it is to have objective evidence of your own competence and decision-making ability. If I hadn't recorded Carol's conversations and gathered independent medical evaluations, her word against mine might have been enough to convince a court that guardianship was necessary and appropriate. The experience with Carol also helped me understand why my children had been initially skeptical of our marriage, and why they'd expressed concerns about my vulnerability as a widower. Robert and Susan had sensed something about Carol that I'd been too lonely and too eager for companionship to see clearly. They'd been protective of my interests and my well-being in ways that I hadn't fully appreciated at the time, and their caution had been based on wisdom and love rather than on jealousy or resistance to my moving on after their mother's death. I apologized to my children for not listening to their concerns more carefully, and for allowing Carol to manipulate our family relationships in service of her criminal scheme. 6 months after Carol's conviction, I'm living peacefully in my own home with complete control over my life and my finances. I've reconnected with old friends and family members who had been concerned about my supposed cognitive decline, and I've been able to demonstrate to everyone that my mental capacity is excellent, and that Carol's claims about my incompetence were completely fabricated. I've also become involved in advocacy work to help other elderly people recognize and protect themselves from financial predators and elder abuse schemes. Through my work with elder law attorneys and advocacy organizations, I've learned that Carol's scheme was unfortunately not unique or unusual. There are many predators who target elderly individuals for financial exploitation, using tactics similar to Carol's to gain control over their victims' assets and decision-making authority. These criminals often present themselves as loving caregivers or devoted family members, while systematically destroying their victims' autonomy and stealing their wealth. The key to protecting oneself from such schemes is maintaining independence, staying connected with trusted friends and family members, and being skeptical of anyone who tries to isolate you or convince you that you're incapable of managing your own affairs. I've also established a foundation that provides resources and support for elderly victims of financial abuse, and that funds legal assistance for people who are fighting guardianship proceedings or other attempts to gain control over their lives and assets. The foundation is funded by a portion of the money that Carol had hoped to steal from me, which seems like an appropriate way to honor the victims of crimes like hers, and to help prevent other families from experiencing the trauma and destruction that predatory schemes can cause. Working with other victims and survivors has shown me that I was fortunate to discover Carol's scheme before she succeeded in having me declared incompetent or institutionalized against my will. Many elderly people are not as lucky, and they lose their freedom and their assets to criminals who use the legal system to legitimize their theft and abuse. The guardianship system, while designed to protect vulnerable adults, can also be exploited by predators who manipulate the process to gain control over people who are perfectly capable of managing their own lives. As for my personal life, I'm much more cautious about relationships now, but also much more confident in my ability to recognize and respond to manipulative behavior. I'm not opposed to companionship or even marriage in the future, but I'm much better educated about the warning signs of financial predators and the importance of protecting my independence and my assets from people who might try to exploit my desire for human connection. Carol's betrayal was painful and frightening, but it also taught me valuable lessons about my own strength and resilience, and about the importance of trusting my instincts even when other people are trying to convince me that my perceptions are wrong. The most satisfying aspect of this entire experience has been proving that Carol's assessment of my mental capacity was not only wrong but deliberately malicious. Every recording I made, every piece of evidence I gathered, and every strategic decision I made to expose her scheme demonstrated that my mind is as sharp as it ever was, and that I'm perfectly capable of protecting myself from people who try to take advantage of me. Carol had underestimated my intelligence and my determination, assuming that I would be a passive victim who could be easily manipulated and controlled. Instead, she discovered that this 74-year-old man was more than capable of outmaneuvering her and her co-conspirators, gathering evidence of their crimes, and ensuring that justice was served. The irony is that Carol's scheme to prove I was mentally incompetent actually provided me with the opportunity to demonstrate just how competent and strategic I really am. By pretending to believe her lies about my cognitive decline while secretly recording her conversations and building a legal case against her, I showed that I was capable of complex planning, strategic thinking, and sophisticated problem-solving under extremely stressful circumstances. Carol had tried to paint me as a confused and helpless old man, but my response to her scheme proved that I was actually a formidable opponent who could protect himself and seek justice when threatened. Today, I'm healthier and happier than I've been since Helen died, and I'm grateful every day for the opportunity to live my life on my own terms, with complete control over my decisions and my resources. I've learned to value my independence and my mental acuity in ways I never did before, and I've gained a deeper appreciation for the importance of staying alert and engaged with the world around me. Carol's attempt to steal my life ultimately made me stronger and more aware, and it reinforced my belief that age is just a number, and that wisdom and experience are valuable assets that shouldn't be underestimated or dismissed. I'm also proud of the fact that my experience has helped other people recognize and protect themselves from similar schemes, and that the foundation I established in response to Carol's crimes is making a real difference in the lives of elderly people who are facing financial exploitation and abuse. Carol thought she was stealing from one confused old man, but instead she helped create a resource that will protect many elderly people from predators like herself. Her criminal behavior has ultimately resulted in more protection and support for the very population she tried to exploit, which seems like perfect justice to me. If there's one lesson I want people to take from my story, it's that elderly individuals are not automatically vulnerable or incompetent simply because of their age, and that anyone who tries to convince you otherwise might have ulterior motives that have nothing to do with your well-being. Trust your own judgment, stay connected with people who genuinely care about you, and never let anyone convince you that you're incapable of managing your own life unless you have clear, objective evidence that such assistance is actually necessary. And if someone is trying to convince you that you're losing your mental capacity while simultaneously trying to gain control over your money and your decisions, that's probably not a coincidence worth ignoring. The human capacity for deception and manipulation is unfortunately limitless, but so is our capacity for wisdom, strength, and justice when we're willing to stand up for ourselves and fight for what's right. Carol learned that lesson the hard way, and I hope her story serves as a warning to other predators who might think that elderly people are easy targets for their criminal schemes. This 74-year-old man proved that assumption wrong, and I'm confident that many other elderly individuals are equally capable of protecting themselves when they understand what they're up against and have the support and resources they need to fight back. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of justice and survival. Share your thoughts about this husband's fight against elder abuse in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our next video for another amazing story of someone who refused to be a victim.